Hello, everyone. It's my huge pleasure to host this episode today with my two wonderful co-hosts. My role today, before I introduce them, is to kind of ground some of the knowledge, some of the geekiness of these two folks, these two gentlemen. With me today is Jono Alderson, broadcasting from York in UK, and Tomek Rudzki, broadcasting from somewhere in Georgian mountains. I cannot pronounce the name of that city. And we'll cover something that's actually quite exciting, especially that I get to talk to Jono about this. And this is going to be a topic of schema markup and why schema is so underappreciated, why it's not being used to this full potential, and why so many marketers are missing out on the full potential of technical SEO, of basically all the potential SEO benefits of that. I couldn't imagine anyone more knowledgeable on that topic than Jono, and Tomek, ex-R&D at Wandly, now co-founder of ZipTie. So again, this is going to be probably a fairly advanced webinar when it comes to geekiness and knowledge. I'll try to ground it, as I mentioned, but I cannot promise much. So without any further ado, Jono Alderson, maybe you can introduce yourself quickly, and then we can switch to Tomek.
Nice. Thank you for the wonderful setup. This is super exciting. I'm looking forward to nerding out. So yeah, I'm Jono. I have a background in web development and technical SEO, but I've also worked in agencies and tool vendors and platforms. So I'm also deeply into the strategy and business side as well. So I really get fascinated by the kind of intersect of those. How can we use all these tools and technologies to do cool stuff, to grow businesses, to make money? So Schema, yeah, I'm super excited about. I have just finished 5.5 years working at Yoast, which I'm sure probably everyone has heard of. If you haven't, you've been under a rock or aren't doing website stuff, so why are you listening to this? Yeah, so I'm now pursuing a career as an independent freelance consultant, looking at all of this kind of schema stuff and other things. So yeah, I'm super excited about this.
I don't think the community is ready for Jono being on the free market, so this is gonna shake up some things for sure. Tomek, show us your view, and if you could say one or two words about yourself before we jump in.
Yeah, so my name is Tomek Rudzki. As Bartosz mentioned, I'm a co-founder of ZipTie. ZipTie is a tool that allows you to diagnose problems with indexing. And today, I'm just very happy to be there with Bartosz and Jono. I know these two guys for years now, and yeah, those are very nice folks. A view, okay. It's as you can see, there is the mountain called Kazbegi. It's over 5,000 meters above the level of the sea. Kind of beautiful view. Just one disclaimer. I'm in the mountain, so I hope so the internet connection will be just fine. But you never know. It's just the mountains. So if something goes wrong, so sorry about that. I will be trying my best. I have my digital nomad toolset, still trying to make it happen, but sometimes the internet. Yeah, but let's go to our topic, I guess, Bartosz, or what's that?
Let's kick this off. I'm still getting used to hosting these episodes with Tomek because he's in a different location every single week, so he's nomading the hell out of it. But let's get going. Jono, you mentioned in the very beginning a few very cool keywords about schema, and I didn't really think about schema this way. I was like, we can get something through schema, we can help Google understand content, but you kind of framed it in this nice way. If you could do that the same for the audience.
We'll try. We'll see if it's as close. Okay, so I'll zoom out and move back a bit first to set some context. For thousands and thousands of years, through the entirety of all human history, all of and feel free to disagree with this, and it's a gross oversimplification, but I think all marketing has been based on the sole premise that you can advertise to an audience, grab their attention, and convince an impressionable, emotional human to cross a threshold. And historically, that would be into a store. Now, in our context, we're talking about mostly visiting websites, because once they cross that threshold, you can control the narrative. and you can try and manage their experience and get them to take some kind of mutually beneficial action, a purchase, a conversion, a sign up, whatever. For thousands and thousands of years, all marketing has been based on that premise that we shout loudly, try and grab somebody out of the competitive environment and take them into our environment. That's been fine, it's worked great, we've built a civilization around that. Now, the last couple of decades, we've increasingly started to see a world where machines and systems act as intermediaries in that process, where Google, Facebook, Twitter, Yandex, Bing, whoever, act as intermediaries, act as bouncers who determine whether or not we are, or we appear to be, a good fit for their audience before we're allowed to access. So no longer can we just go and shout and grab attention. We have to ask permission, pass a set of criteria, and then go and shout. And that might be Full Web Vitals, it might be EEAT, in the paid space, it might be quality score, but these barriers to entry exist that prevent us from just having free access to this market. So part of the way that these systems deal with evaluating whether we're a good fit is through these large language systems, machine learnings, AIs, black boxes, etc., where they can generally do a reasonably good job of guessing whether or not we look like a good fit. But they miss a key thing here, and that's precision. That whilst they can kind of generally ascertain the quality of a web page, they also need to understand, I don't know, for an article, what was the name of the author, and what was that author's Twitter URL, and what's the logo of the organization that publishes that website, and what's the stock status of the product in their marketplace and its return policy. These are things that you can machine learn a little bit, but you're never going to achieve the degree of precision that Google and other systems need in order to utilize that information reliably. So the toolkit that is powering all of this precision, that increasingly is the language and the architecture behind it, is Schema.org. And some other related standards as well, but this is why it's so important. I'm sure there's loads we can explore, but the core premise is, if we want to reliably and precisely communicate who we are, what we do, what our stock status is, the name of our author's husband, etc., all of these things with precision, then we need to be using this language. And I think if you zoom back out a bit again, what we're talking about is essentially controlling the narrative. In the same way that a huge amount of what we do in marketing and digital marketing is trying to spend dollars to control how people perceive us and to manage that with precision, we're talking about exactly the same thing, but doing it for machines, just not humans. This is just marketing. Or digital marketing, I guess, if we want to be fancy. So yeah, I think this is super important.
That was beautiful, Jono. I didn't expect for the big picture to go thousands of years before humanity, but maybe not humanity before like our modern civilization, but I cannot agree more. So just to summarize that, what you're trying to get across and how I understand that is basically with these schema markups, with marking our websites through different, obviously there are hundreds of possibilities of how you can do that. You take the guesswork out of these heuristics or these machine learnings at Google, which is not always precise, and we've been there, every single one of us, to have a very precise and detailed markup. Okay, this is the product, this is the stock, and so on. So you basically take that narrative back to your business, and that's a very nice way to frame schema markup, and I think you should actually work in their advertising division. So thank you for that.
Awesome. Yeah, that's completely it. And it is about removing that ambiguity in the stories you want to tell. And it is interesting, like that's not how a lot of Google's ecosystem in particular has worked historically. Like, they really don't like website owners telling them what their page is about. There's a reason they deprecated meta keywords, because obviously everyone just spams it with Viagra. And now we're back into an age where actually it turns out they are reliant on us to describe our things, because no amount of machine learning will allow them to remove enough ambiguity from their crawling and scraping processes. So they have to rely on us to say, okay, this is a star rating, this is a review, this is the object the review is of, and these are the comments on the article, but these are the comments on the product, and they're different things, and really unpicking that for them. I've seen, probably shouldn't talk about this too much, but there is some interesting divided opinions behind the scenes at Google about which of these routes is better. And the search team do not get along with the structured data team, because the search team really want all this to be machine learned and automatic. And the rich results team and the schema folks, it's like, no, it's just not feasible. We have to have precision. Otherwise, we can't build stuff on top of it. So it's an interesting dynamic.
And if we look at that, I just wanted to add that with, and I can relate 100% to how search teams often imagine their algorithms as so precise, when in fact, when working with a lot of big brands, you see how these heuristics sometimes are, skewed towards something. Because, we have limited resources, we have JavaScript, we have rendering, we have all of these aspects. Then sometimes your JavaScript is going to switch your markups or your content. So basically, if you can have that schema markup planted there firmly by you, and you have a deep understanding of how that looks like, you don't risk these heuristics, this machine learning algorithms to kind of play with you. Because if they learn something, that's what I learned is the biggest problem. If a machine algorithm is going to learn something about your website, changing that, even search teams, they will tell you, like, there's not much we can do. This is not something where we can just flip a switch. So I think this is I didn't look at that this way, but this is a very nice perspective, Jono. Thank you for that.
Yeah, as like a risk reduction thing, that's super important. Like, control that narrative before they accidentally encode the wrong logo or the wrong brand name or the CEO's wrong image or whatever. Yeah, getting ahead of that is quite a good deal.
Yeah,
I've got a question, Jono, about this. Like, so people could guess, could get that from some of Google's representatives, that over the thousands of years, Google has been getting better and better at understanding what websites are, how to get the main content, how to understand what the page is talking about. And my question is, how to convince people, hey, you need to use schema.org, because Google may not be that perfect at understanding your content. Because people can get that information from other sites, saying like, okay, like Google is getting better, Google can get your content. So how to convince people, hey, use schema.org?
So I think at the moment, a lot of the stuff they can get reasonably well and reasonably right just using their heuristics. But as Bartosz says, like, there are so many scenarios where you see in the real world that actually they're not nearly as sophisticated as they appear to be, or when you start dealing with the complexities of big, complex websites, all sorts of stuff starts falling out. But I think where they are definitely going to need the level of precision that they can't get from just inferring stuff is the relationships between entities. And this is the kind of next generation of where this stuff is going. There was quite a subtle update a few months ago now to Google's documentation around recipe schema. And previously it was like, mark up your recipe, put in the calories, describe the thing, put in an image, put in a video, etc. And people were copying and pasting the code, not really understanding it, doing fine, etc. And interestingly, it looked like when you look at the search results in those kind of recipe spaces, the video results often didn't quite line up with the conventional results. So they updated the documentation and they said critically, if you have a video of a recipe, you need to describe the relationship between those concepts. And you can do that using schema. It's a pretty standard thing, but it was the first time we'd ever seen Google acknowledging a deficiency in their ability to connect the dots between things. You need to explicitly say, this is a recipe, this is a video, and this video is of this recipe, or it represents this recipe, or it represents a stage within it. And that precise control and joining up those things is something which is going to be super hard for them to do. It's so easy for them to go, this page contains a recipe and a video. Great. But how confident can they be that that video is of that recipe? And yeah, okay, they could even process it. They could OCR it. They could extract all the text and all the audio. But even then, that's costly. And it's going to take time and resources, which we know they are far more bottlenecked on than they are willing to talk about publicly. You've certainly seen that when you've looked at the JavaScript space. And also, again, there's still, even if they get to 95% accuracy, is that enough? Is that going to produce good results for people? So describing the relationships between entities is the whole next tier of this. And it's critical for us to do that, for them to understand stuff. And they're starting to acknowledge that.
I also wanted to jump in and add one more thing, because it's also what we're seeing with our SGE research and scraper, basically Google algo is very good at understanding user intent, and you know, they can match that fairly well. But we can see that this machine learning algorithm at core of Google is not really communicating to SGE. So when you search for something, Google is understanding that intent very well. And I think it was house investment calculator, something like this, where basically SGE, as an example for people in the audience to search for, where Google is going to show you a calculator, but SGE is going to show you how to build a calculator. And, you know, that's not really useful. And I can only imagine that this touches on what you mentioned, Jono, is how do we connect machine learning algorithms between each other so that they start talking? This is really difficult. So with video understanding, this is very good at YouTube. YouTube is amazing, but then how do we merge these ecosystems? And I think with the rise of AI, rise of robots, we'll see a lot of these ecosystems having to chat to each other. And I think the schema markup might be that translator, might be that middleman to basically tell them all, this is what this page is about. This is how we adjust.
Quite possibly. I think one of the reasons that schema.org in particular might be a good fit for that. There are thousands of standards for describing and building taxonomies of stuff, and they all have different pros and cons. But schema.org was specifically designed to describe the kinds of content that people put on websites. And that's the domain we're interested in, we're exploring, it's what Google's extracting, etc. So the kinds of things that it can describe and the kinds of ways that it defines those relationships actually is a really good fit for solving that exact problem. So yeah, maybe it becomes a universal language, needs a bit more adoption and some tweaking, but it is probably the best bad tool we have for the job, other than just like the English language, which is a little bit non-precise again. So yeah, same problem.
Thank you. And I wanted to follow up to this with a question, Jono. So looking at like a regular Joe in online business, so someone who owns an e-commerce store, maybe a large blog, something like this, talking in the terms of basically benefits, because I guess this is all coming down to, you know, if I will implement schema, what am I getting out of this? If we could go like a level down and just, because I guess this is how we convince people to change their habits.
Yeah, absolutely. You need some kind of tactical ROI to get the ball rolling. I think the easiest one of those is the rich results ecosystem, which by now I think everyone is pretty familiar with. Long gone are the days when your search results were 10 blue links that you had to evaluate and choose from. And increasingly the world we live in is either SGE, which I'm on the fence about, or some kind of selection of cards, tools, widgets, things, more and more of which are powered by either directly or informed by structured data. And in some sectors, I know recipes again as an example, if you're not using structured data and rich results and schema.org, you can't even compete. And it's not that this stuff makes you rank higher or increases any kind of ranking signal, but it does radically change the way that the types of results that you're eligible for and the kind of real estate and interactivity and access to spaces that comes with. So yeah, the immediate tactical ROI is if you're trying to sell stuff, or if you have services, or you're trading on the trust of your authors, or you're writing reviews, or any of the kinds of activities that Google has rich results formats for, then if you're not in those spaces and eligible for those result types, your competitors almost certainly are, and they're going to stand out more, they're going to get better click-through rate, they're going to incite more trust from their users in the search results. And as Google's search ecosystem continues to change and evolve, you're not going to be in those spaces. So we talk about Google search, but this is also Google Discover, which is hugely influenced by certain types of schema like article markup and the ways you describe your image and your organization's logo. Or Google Merchant Center, which once upon a time was kind of tucked away with Google Shopping, but now increasingly is like a core part of the organic results. And I'll talk about this a bit more in a bit, I think, but I see lots of evidence that Google are increasingly trying to use Merchant Center as part of organic results to compete with Amazon, to make the Google search results pages more like an online catalog. All of that is powered by schema. And then access to other ecosystems as well. So huge parts of Meta use and read structured data. Bing, Naver, other search engines use structured data and schema. Slack, WhatsApp, Outlook, Skype, all these systems use structured data and things like rich previews and interactive results. And there are thousands and thousands of things that consume this information that, yeah, maybe some of them are quite small, but the long tail of the utilization of this is huge. So again, tactically controlling that narrative, and yeah, in some nice cases, that means fancier result formats, more clicks, more visits, more trust, etc. It's hard to not make a case for this because the power, like, it's so important today tactically, so important tomorrow strategically.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you, Jono. I didn't expect this to go and to be. I'm learning myself. I'm not a schema markup person at Onely, and I think now I probably should be. But one last clarification or question to this: if you could give me a few examples of either verticals or places where this actually works very well, and I'm sure you probably have something in the back of your head of like, if you're in this vertical, if you're not using schema markup, like, go home.
Yeah, and e-commerce is the obvious one that comes to mind because so much of the search experience when Google decides that the thing you're searching for is probably a transactional intent, you don't get a list of 10 links, you don't get nice articles, you get products. And increasingly that looks more and more like an e-commerce page. There are reviews, there are star ratings, there are recently pros and cons of products, there are the names of the people who reviewed them, there's image previews, there's thumbnails, there's videos. If you're in the e-commerce space and you're not taking advantage of all of that, you are going to have to be doing something exceptional to be competing, whether that's on price or on phenomenal brand reputation. But if you're in a commoditized space, even a slightly commoditized space, if you have anyone else selling the same products as you in the same space at a similar price, their results are going to look phenomenal and interactive and comprehensive, and yours aren't. So yeah, because e-commerce is particularly a big deal because it touches on many types of structured data, products, offers, reviews. There's all sorts of moving parts on this, images, videos, etc. And these all come together to describe the thing you're offering. And if you're not doing that well, yeah, you're going to miss out. Other spaces are quite interesting. Jobs. Oh, sorry, go on.
Yeah, go on. Yeah, I wanna hear more.
I've talked about recipes a lot, but yeah, recipes is a complete space. Movies, like if you search for movie information, a lot of the kind of carousel content and who was the director and when was this released, that sort of stuff is powered by Schema. And I know there probably aren't many normal website people competing on movies, but you start to get the idea of how many verticals this is interacting with, in the same way that like Google is probably your biggest competitor in increasing numbers of spaces with Google Flights, Google Hotels, Google Jobs. They sweep in and they take over. This is happening with Schema as well. The e-learning space, they've been investing a huge amount of energy recently. Things like homework helpers and formulas and math solvers got a huge amount of attention recently. So yeah, there's loads of spaces where it's pretty much mandatory to have this, otherwise you're going to struggle.
Thank you. And I'm sure you probably have more topics to talk about, but I wanted to ask, what would be the good resource to get started for those of people listening who are like, okay, I'm sold on the topic, Jono, you made my day, but now let's get moving. So where would you point them to get started? I know that, I think, Tomek, you wrote something in your book about ChatGPT, about using ChatGPT for Schema, if I remember correctly. But so I saw this is a very popular approach now, that like someone would paste the page, like, this is my website, this is my page, this is documentation, give me the markup. But I'm assuming there are other ways to do that without AI.
Yeah, that would definitely help, but it's risky, right? If the objective here is precision and control, and you're handing it off to a system that's liable to hallucinate on 5 of the bits, then that's risky. And also, so much of the implementation of Schema out on the web is bad, that it's been trained on bad Schema from people who've copy-pasted bits of code and not understood it. I strongly recommend that people don't try and hand code this. And I think if you are trying to do it from scratch, it's probably the wrong approach. You really want to be in a place where your content management system, or whatever system you have that's running your website, has a deeply baked in system that references and understands all of the things on a given page and does the heavy lifting of describing those relationships for you. And there's a few reasons for that. One is this stuff is hard to do by hand, because we're talking about complex nested relational JSON, and most people are going to miss a comma or a semicolon or not understand quite how IDs should work, and you're going to make a mess. But more significantly, I think maintaining this when it goes stale is quite hard. So if your organization changes its logo, how many places do you need to go and change that? And what happens if you miss one? Like you're now doing the opposite of precision. You are now explicitly confusing systems like Google. It's like when you get your canonical URLs wrong and you self-canonicalize onto pages with queries. So you're taking the standard and you are completely doing it backwards. You're making a mess. So a lot of people do this badly. I think there is somehow most of the major SEO add-ons, plugins, extensions for most major content management systems will do a reasonable job of getting the foundation right. As the person who scoped and wrote most of Yoast's implementation, I would definitely recommend that if you're in the WordPress or Shopify space. Not because it solves everything, but because the core approach is really sophisticated and really robust, and it's a way of writing schema and JSON structures that many people don't use. Google's documentation on this stuff, quite good for understanding what rich results you can achieve, but it's a terrible resource for implementing schema because it assumes that everything that you're implementing is like an isolated thing. So you want a recipe, copy paste this recipe code. You want a video, copy paste this video code. It doesn't ever anticipate that actually what you have is a web page on a website run by an organization that published an article on that website that has an author who wrote a recipe that has a video. And that, like, describing those relationships is where you need to start. So you need to design a structure that's going to contain and cross-reference all those things. That's very, very hard to do if you're handwriting stuff or copy pasting bits of Google's documentation. So 2 places I would go. One is developer.yoast.com, where there's a section on schema where I've written too many thousands of words on the fundamental backgrounds of the approach and how to get started with a small bit and build it up and expand. If you're not on WordPress or Yoast SEO, you can still use this. You don't need to worry about the software. It describes the principles and the behavior and the mechanics and how all those things should interact. And then schema.org itself. So I would ignore the Google side initially and go and build a kind of mental model of what are the types of things that I can describe. What is on my web pages and on my website that has a thing that can be described in schema and vice versa, and start to map all that out a bit, and then go look at, okay, what are Google's requirements on top of that? Because they add some additional requirements, some additional logic. Like the schema.org standard doesn't inherently have a concept of required fields or even recommended fields. It just has things you can describe and properties. But then on top of that, Google says, in order to be eligible for recipe-rich results, you have to have an image, which is interesting for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which, do blind people not cook? Like, can I not have a recipe that doesn't have an image? Because Google has a layer of standards that benefits their ecosystem. So that's the last step, is to go to like the how do rich result formats work. Start with an architecture where you describe all your stuff, and then tweak and add to and adjust that very, very top layer in order to hit Google standards.
So long story short, either you have to spend many hours researching documentation, or you can just email Jono for help.
Yeah, I'm happy to help.
Okay, Tomek, you're awfully quiet for knowing yourself, so I'm assuming you either have a question or internet broke down completely. I think we might have lost
this video. Just got mountains. Maybe he's asleep.
Maybe he's asleep. I don't think so. This is too exciting of a topic for Tomek. But anyhow, Jono, while we wait for Tomek to come back, I wanted to continue this topic and ask you, like, what would be, because you mentioned this is basically an architecture of how you use that, how these things interact. How would you go about, structuring that? Because there are a lot of things at play. There are a lot of different factors affecting this. So do you have any advice of, like, would you draw that in, like, how do you make sense of all the markups you have? Like, because I'm assuming you need to have some kind of place where everything is mapped out.
Yeah. So there's a few bits to that. And again, the developer documentation I wrote handles some of this, but the principle is most approaches to schema will try and get you to build a complex tree with lots of branches. So we have a web page that has an author, that has and you get very, very complex supporting things. You can use a different approach, which Google doesn't talk about at all, and put all of these things into a graph. And it's it's a very, very slightly different way of writing the schema markup, but it's like trivial. And what that lets you do is make a completely flat structure. So you just essentially have a list of all the things. So I know on this page that contains a recipe, I need an organization, a website, a web page, an article, a person, an image, a video, etc. And I don't have to worry about how is this hierarchy and how they all interrelate. So I just have whatever logic system I have, put all of those out into this graph. And then I go, okay, how are these things related? I know that the organization is the publisher of the web page. Then I've got an interesting choice because Schema has directionality. So either I can do the organization as the publisher of the web page, or the web page was published by the organization. And there's not a huge amount of difference, but you do want a kind of consistent approach so that you can visualize it. And then once you started to put that together, you want some kind of software that helps you visualize that as a connected graph. So the kit I use is classyschema.org. You paste your schema into that or the URL, and it spits out like a force network diagram of how these things are interrelated. And you can use that to then say, okay, that connection doesn't make sense, or wait a minute, why isn't the person connected to the article as the author? And you can start to see this the way that Google sees it. You see the entities, you see their relationships, and you start to understand in a much more holistic way the story you're trying to tell. And then you want to get to the point where, okay, the content that I see and interact with on the website as a human is the same story I'm describing here, and all of that nuance and all of those connections. Like I intrinsically understand that the author of the West recipe is probably the same person as the author of the web page, and you want to say all that explicitly. So make all the stuff that you humanly get implicitly explicitly described in the graph, and you just use classy schema and describe all those relationships.
Thank you, and we'll include that in the show notes below, just for everyone to see, because Jono just pasted that in the chat. So thank you for that. This actually makes sense, because I was like, with everything you mentioned, and working with in our case with a lot of large brands, we have to map this out somehow. So we create all these documentation. We draw that very often in like different software to have like a visual representation as well. But that software, I'm not sure if our schema experts know that. So thank you for that. This is definitely useful. Tomek,
the other useful thing is there's an enterprise software app called Schema app, which is really good for kind of higher end brands who want a bit of handholding and consultancy to set this up. Really, really cool. Big shout out to them. They have a resource on their website that helps you map how you might connect one type of thing to another. So for example, you've got a product and you want to describe its relationship to the web page. You plug those both in and it'll say, okay, your web page can be about your product, or your product can be the main entity of your web page. And it gives you all those options, and you can start to use that to understand how things might be related and join the dots a little bit, because otherwise it's not necessarily clear. How do I relate a price to a product? Because actually you've got to go through an offer, and that's not necessarily intuitive. So it helps you draw those little journeys.
Okay. I also pasted that in the chat, so we have that in the notes.
Nice.
Yeah, and my next question would be, let's say that I have a website. I'm watching this, and I'm like, my schema markup is amazing for sure. Like I found a guy on Fiverr. He said that he's an expert. He implemented that beautifully. How do I check if I'm missing out?
Nice. So step one is the validator.schema.org, which will tell you if your code is valid. Step one, and it will flag things like you've missed a semicolon or this doesn't make sense. Step two is the rich results test from Google, which will tell you what type of rich results is this eligible for, and have you met all of Google's criteria for them? Very nice. Neither of those will answer your question of what else could I do? So that's where I really lean heavily on classyschema.org and schema.org. So I put my code into Classy Schema and it shows me this network diagram of here's all the things on this page and how they're related. And I go, isn't it strange that that author doesn't have an image? I should have a thumbnail of them, and that image should have a width and a height. And those width and heights should be pixels. And you start to define all these bits. So you need to have a reasonable understanding of what's possible from schema.org by looking through, okay, I sell, I don't know, I'm a car retailer. There's whole sections of schema on car retailing, including like what's the engine size and what your opening hours and what's the brand of the cars that you sell. You go and you look at the kinds of things that can be described. You look at your schema graph and visualize it, and you go, okay, I see the car, I don't say what the brand is. So I say what the brand is, but I don't say what the website is. You build out those strings.
Thank you for that example of car dealerships, because that experience here in the US, yeah, they could use a lot of help. That was extremely confusing and not very well optimized. So I would say that car dealers here in the US could do a little bit of a better job with that. So that's 100% a good approach. Tomek, are you back?
Yeah, for sure, I'm back. I just get too much sun covering my face, so I was just wanted to switch my position, and then the internet disconnected for some reason.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Tomek, do you have anything to add to the topic, or should we move forward? I'm sure you have a lot of aspects. Yeah?
I think that's pretty easy, like diagnosing the problem. So we need to go to the next topic.
Okay. Jono, I think I've exhausted most of my questions when it comes to implementing that, figuring out how to do that, and you've mentioned quite a lot of resources. So just before we wrap, I wanted to ask if there is anything you think is not working out, anything else you wanted to add. Just get it off your chest, knowing you quite a bit so far.
Sure. So two key things are worth exploring, I think. One is three things then. One is the whole SEO industry is not very good at this stuff, and they think they are, and they copy paste stuff in, and they think they've done a good job because they've got a rich result, but quite often their schema is lacking or erroneous or doesn't describe things comprehensively. Classy Schema is such a good tool for visualizing that. Before we got on the call, I was looking through a few kind of really high-end websites and some odds and ends to see how they do. Disney schema is a mess, Lego schema is a mess, Apple schema is a mess. Apple on their product pages say we sell an iPhone, but they don't say where it's from or who, or they don't connect it to Apple as the brand, so it's not necessarily implicit. Yeah, obviously Apple is the person who sells iPhones, so it's not the best example, but they're not controlling that narrative, and they really ought to be, as should everybody. So one. Two is it's not just SEOs who are bad at this; it's also Google. So I mentioned earlier, like Google's additional layers and logic that they put on top of schema.org are often counterintuitive or quite complex or not necessarily in everybody's favor except theirs. There are so many examples where different parts of Google have spec'd this differently. So for example, a publisher of a news article has to have a logo that's a certain size. But if it's not a news article, the logo rules are different. But an organization can only have one logo. So if I publish some things that are news and some things that aren't, is it two different organizations? And the Search Console report for logos only shows the logos it's found if the organization is on the leading edge of the graph, which is a very technical term based on like the relationships between the directions between the relationships between the things. An organization is only ever going to be in the graph as like the publisher of a website or of a brand behind a product. So it's never going to be on the leading edge. So if you've got results in Search Console for logo, then your schema is probably wrong because you've done it the way that Google says to do it rather than the way that makes sense. So there's loads of examples like this. FAQ page works the opposite way from QA page, despite them being like fundamentally the same thing, just for a different use case. And you can't have an FAQ page about an event selling tickets because those rich result formats don't integrate. You can't describe the relationships between those things in a way that Google will be satisfied with all of them. And best of all yet, there is no way to describe product variations, which is quite a common thing on the web. I have a T-shirt that is available in red or green or large and small. There is no solution in Schema.
I know that firsthand. This is so painful. Like, why? Like, this is the most popular problem for e-commerces, I think.
Yeah, and this is such a big example of like Google's vision of the web is like one URL, one entity, one thing, and they can't reconcile a solution that has multiple variations. And even there is schema for it, but it's super verbose. Like you've got to describe product groups and their relationships. But if you do that, then you're not eligible for any of Facebook or Meta Marketplace's stuff. So that's pretty frustrating. What is fascinating on the back of that is if you go to, do I have this? Yes, I do. If you go to the schema.org repository on GitHub, schema.org is open source, so it's all on GitHub, and you search for the phrase from Google in the open issues, there are teams and teams of people at Google who are requesting new features in schema.org because the Google search team wants to read them or use them to expose rich result formats. This is Google's roadmap for the SERPs. This is the stuff that they want to understand from websites to feature. And like, look, okay, mobile URL is a distinct property, things about courses, shorter names, different things about TV episodes, more e-commerce stuff, adding causes of medical conditions. You can look at this at a glance and go, okay, what are the teams at Google wanting to do with this stuff? It's absolutely huge. It's a phenomenal insight into kind of where they're looking at going. So that's pretty cool. Last thing I wanted to touch on was both Google Merchant Center and Facebook Marketplace, or Meta Marketplace, if they've renamed it by now, are increasingly using schema as a primary source of truth. So previously, if you wanted your products to be in Google Merchant Center, etc., you'd need some kind of RSS feed export thing, which you probably paid tens of thousands of dollars for because it's a crazy industry to set up and pipe stuff into the background, manage all your stock status and make sure it's up to date. Very cumbersome, very expensive. What Google and Facebook are now doing is, as their crawl processes, which already happen because your website's getting crawled, hit your site, they read your stock status and pricing and automatically update your catalog information in their systems with the latest information. So we're starting to see the birth of an era where your schema.org markup on your website is turning your websites and web pages into databases of information that these systems consume. So today, your website is mostly a marketing pamphlet to convince humans to do things. Tomorrow, it needs to be at least 50% of it needs to also be a database that's feeding third-party systems and crawlers with the information that they need in order to represent and populate your content in their ecosystems. And this is really ramping up. Like Facebook have done so much with this on like every time they come and hit and crawl your page, they're syncing all of your product information, which I think like this is day one of something huge if this progresses, and it reduces so much overhead and costs. But there's an interesting question around things like the product variations. Does this mean that we have, like, if this is tied to a system that's reliant on crawling and indexing, and we know that there are problems in that ecosystem, and we know that a lot of this world is powered by JavaScript, and despite me yelling otherwise, so many people still generate schema.org markup with JavaScript or inject it via Google Tag Manager. None of these systems interact well today. How on earth are they going to get this right? So yeah, I firmly believe in the potential of all this, and I think it's super tactically valuable to go look at Google's roadmap, but I'm not convinced that these things will necessarily come together cleanly in the near future. But where there's chaos and where there's mess, there's opportunity. And definitely it still makes sense to have the most comprehensive, have the most sophisticated schema because systems are using this.
I'm shocked. So first of all, I'm shocked to hear about a lot of these issues with Google because we're observing them from a different, probably my perspective on that. And the number of conversations where, like, when I was pushing either Martin or John to say, can you openly say that JavaScript-powered websites don't index well? Because this is hard data. This is not me hallucinating. This is something you can say with Walmart, with Target, with Wayfair, with any of these large websites, with Levi's, and they can try all the different ways of pre-rendering them and try to do hundreds of these different things, but then most companies and most tech stacks don't really understand how to pre-render. So anyhow, I see this problem from a different side. When Googlers with limited resources, my assumption is they have to kind of they cannot openly say, okay, Google is a little bit broken because that's
because the modern web is JavaScript and we're not designed to do with it. Yeah, great PR.
But this is a universal truth coming from you. I love to hear that because I usually feel a little bit like this crazy guy standing on a wooden box, like Google is broken. So long story short, I think we all, regardless of is it schema markup, is it technical SEO, is it indexing, rendering, we need to understand that Google has limited resources and it's not changing. At the same time, they have limited team resources. And at the same time, we're in the middle of recession. And this is also hitting Google quite a bit with their layoffs and so on. We can see that this is a problem. So with all that, we have to make Google's job as easy as possible, but also, as you mentioned, in all the possible verticals, be very aware of their limitations. And we know that Google, since 2016, I think with John Gianandrea back then, switched to machine learning, which I hated personally, and I still have mixed feelings about that, because they were all so sold on this idea. But we need to understand that Google's algo is not algo anymore, because technically it's a machine learning kind of ecosystem. So with all that, schema markup is our point of truth, as I understand. And even though we have so many heuristics on Google, so if Google is going to crawl your website and you have like 3 different pages, then 3 pages that are different than 100 different pages, most likely Google is going to just go through that like a like a truck driving through a Coke can and skip that. So schema markup is our way of just finding these points of truth and just maybe teaching Google a little bit of, okay, this is how this could be done. And that's why I love talking to John about these things, because this is also a point when I think, okay, I'm not the only one seeing some of the things that we can address as the SEO community. I think this is a beautiful wrap up of this episode. I think we've went through so much stuff that probably we have like 3 articles to write from this script. Tomek, Jono, anything you want to add in the very end of this episode? Tomek is probably froze again, so we didn't have Tomek today, which is actually good, because with Tomek and Jono at the same time, your heads could explode. Tomek just disconnected. So, Jono, is there anything you wanted to say? I don't think it's possible with Tomek. So, Jono, is there anything you wanted to add at the very end to close up?
I guess just thank you for the opportunity to rant about this. Like, as you say, I often feel like I'm also the crazy person on the wooden box saying, look how broken this is. And yeah, I certainly see up close a lot of the challenges they have with resourcing and indexing and rendering, and that is not going to get any easier. And you see the changing narrative from John and Gary and others across things like the behind the scenes podcast, where they're starting to talk more and more about resource constraints and limitations. I think especially now we look at the rise of generative AI, the web is going to be full of so much crap, and so much of it will be undifferentiated and generic. And schema.org will be a tool for the real brands with the good content to really manage and control and stand out. So I think that's super important. But that wasn't what I was going to say. What I was going to say is, yeah, I'm now an independent consultant specializing in, amongst other things, this sort of stuff. So if this is all a bit overwhelming and you want a little bit of a hand holding, then give me a shout.
And knowing Jono for so many years, and I'm very picky with people we talk to and work with, I wouldn't hesitate for a second to hire Jono for any help. He's always a person when I get stuck with something. And I remember even with JavaScript experiment we've done years and years ago, I was asking about some HTTP2, whatever. I remember I was like, if someone knows like the sane answer to that, that's Jono. So for years I was looking at Jono with a lot of respect towards his geekiness and nerdiness in these topics, because you can see, I think, after this episode that this guy lives and breathes these things, and we need more of people like this in the community. So thank you so much, Jono. I truly appreciate where you're coming from this, because I know you want to serve people, you want to make a web a little bit better. So and that's been your job description basically for the past years at Yoast. And I'm looking forward to seeing where your next step in your career is going to take you, because I think whoever is going to work with you is extremely lucky to have you to look into that schema.
Thank you so much. Lovely.
We could go on, because you mentioned like 5 things that triggered me into some other topics. So I'll consciously say this is a hard stop. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time we'll probably have Tomek with better internet. So brace yourself, folks. We have 1 more or 2 more episodes with Jono. Thank you so much once again. Have a beautiful day, and we'll have write-up and all the links underneath this episode. If you have any questions, we'll include Jono's website and email. So hit him up. He's a wonderful guy to go. And once again, thanks so much to you, Jono, and thank you for you, Tomek, as well, even though you didn't have a lot of chances because of the internet to pitch in.
Give us a great view.
It's fine.
Thank you, guys. Eats it up, and then we can do a clap.